Corey, you good?
Yeah. When we look at video games, they're quite different from traditional media. Traditional media, whether it's film, television, a novel, play, a sporting event, is a relatively passive experience, and content flows in one direction from the source of entertainment or narrative to the audience. It's traditionally relatively one-directional and passive experience. None of your actions will alter the content, or if it does, it's usually in inappropriate ways. You can shout at a movie screen, tell the woman in a horror film not to go down the stairs or into the house, but she will not respond to you. With games, you have the added aspect of interaction. You have a controller and you can actually interact with the content. So this interaction is one aspect, and the second is that the game then responds and provides feedback to your interaction. And so you have this loop of consuming content, interacting with the content, and then receiving feedback from the content. And it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, all the way throughout the experience. And I remember getting my first consoles, and I had an Atari, and I had a Coleco, and I had all of that stuff. And it wasn't until I had an Apple IIe, and I was playing a game called Ultima 5, where this entire world sort of opens up as soon as you start the game, and you can go anywhere pretty much and do anything. Really, your only limitations are where you can go and if you can survive the environment around you. So my intense love of games eventually led me to work in the industry, and I wouldn't have it any other way. But I very quickly realized that there is a very major difference in the way we approach narrative in games versus more traditional forms of entertainment. And I think the major distinction is that whereas traditional entertainment tells a single story, the story of a protagonist of a fictional world and the characters that create it, when you're dealing with a game, you actually find yourself in a position where you're telling two stories. It's the story of the player and the story of the protagonist. And the story of the protagonist concerns itself primarily with more traditional forms of entertainment. And this is all about the fictional universe that's created, the characters that inhabit it, the locations where it's based, the events that unfold, the reasons that people do what they do within that space. Games also concern themselves with the player story. And those are the rules and regulations, the mechanics, the design that govern interaction in the virtual space where games take place. And so if we look to something like Assassin's Creed 2, a game I worked on, I can walk you through a couple of very quick examples of how we address player story versus protagonist story. We ask the same questions, whether it's player or protagonist that we're talking about. It's those traditional questions of who, what, when, where, how, and why. And so let's look at something like the question of who, right? So as far as the protagonist story is concerned, we'll address who our character is, where they come from, what their backstory is, what their personality is like, what the inciting events and incidents that define and shape them are. And then in terms of the player story, we concern ourselves with what are the animation sets that define their personality, that express their personality? What's the character design? What do their clothes look like? How do they work? What are the physics that govern the way that cloth and hair and all that stuff moves? So even though it sounds technical, it's all part of, right, creating a cohesive and compelling and immersive story. Those animations help to reflect the personality that's created or defined by the protagonist story. So there's this interplay, this attempt to bring together both player and protagonist story there. And then from the player story perspective, it's really about physically building, the architecture of those spaces, the building blocks that create the buildings or that create the pathways that the player can then move through and interact with. So we've got these two stories. We have the player story and the protagonist story. And one of the problems or challenges that we run into during production is that these two stories are often framed as being in competition with one another. And I think it's very important that moving forward, and this is something that I spend a lot of my time here at Ubisoft working on, is trying to bring these two stories into a place where they're collaborating rather than competing with each other. Something we try and work on is trying to find a way to match drama with mechanics so that everything that's being designed for the game is being designed in service of a singular thing. So we've got these two stories now. We want them to collaborate with one another, but there are still some challenges that we're facing. And chief among them is something known as Ludo narrative dissonance. And this is a term that was actually coined by someone that used to work at Ubisoft, a guy named Clint Hawking. It refers to the sort of gap between the player story and the protagonist story, in that space where they don't quite connect. So wherever the fictional narrative doesn't quite match up with the experience that's being created for the player. So Clint Hawking used language to address and identify a problem, Ludo narrative dissonance. And it's my belief that we can use language to begin to solve the problem. And I think one of the ways that we do this is by redefining the way that we approach video game building. So traditionally, we've divided it up to this idea of story versus gameplay. It's these two different disciplines that are constantly at odds with one another. There's a lot of tension, a lot of back and forth, a lot of compromise, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of I'm more important, no, I'm more important. So that's something that we should try and get rid of. So it's not a competition, it's a collaboration. And let's not think of it as story versus gameplay, but story plus gameplay. When you combine those two things, what you get is something that I call experience. And I think that's a word that most people are familiar with. And it works as a really great foundation for building out games, because now everything is being informed and defined by an agreed upon experience that is then reflected throughout all disciplines on a team, whether it's mission design or art direction or animation or the actual written script. Everything is in service to an agreed upon experience. So there's no more tension. There's a single source of inspiration and a single source of defining the fantasy that you want the player to go on. And the idea of going with an experience also builds on this idea of increased immersion and credibility, which is, I think, something that applies to all forms of storytelling, no matter the medium. So as we work and strive towards a future in which all interactive entertainment is created in an intensely and highly collaborative environment, we're going to face several challenges. And I think chief among them are ensuring that there is trust, respect, and really strong communication between all of the different disciplines on a given project. And only by making sure that everyone is in sync and everyone is serving a singular vision can we hope to create a truly compelling and immersive experience. And I think another thing that we really have to start doing is changing the way we think about games in general. And traditionally they've been seen as software, right? It's features, it's technology, it's that sort of stuff that drives innovation. But we have to start thinking about games as a form of entertainment. And that means really letting the experience drive the entire process. Because only by doing this can we hope to shrink the gap between the player and the screen, and hopefully one day we'll be able to bring those two things completely together so that they're one and the same.